If you walk through the streets of downtown Los Angeles or scroll through the headlines in San Francisco, it feels like California is unraveling. But if you look closely at the data, the real story is not what you see on the news. It is what you see in your bank account. Everyone has a theory about what will finally break the Golden State. Is it the lawlessness of rising crime? The human tragedy of 480,000 homeless neighbors? Or is it the crushing weight of a $3,000 rent check? Today, we are not just guessing. We are analyzing the hard numbers from 2024 and 2025 to determine which of these four crises, housing, crime, homelessness, or the economy, is actually the single biggest existential threat to the future of California. The answer might actually surprise you. To understand the magnitude of the challenges facing California, one must first look at the most visceral and visible contender for the title of biggest threat, the rise in crime. For millions of residents, the perception of safety is shattered, driven by viral videos of smash-and-grab robberies and high-profile assaults. When we examine the 2024 crime statistics for California's major urban centers, the data paints a complicated picture. In cities like Oakland, the violent crime rate has surged to approximately 39.25 incidents per 1,000 residents, a figure that is undeniably alarming and significantly higher than the national average. Property crime in the same area has hit a staggering 92.3 incidents per 1,000 residents, meaning that for many living there, theft is not a possibility, but a probability. Stockton, too, faces a severe crisis with a violent crime rate of roughly 33.96 per 1,000 people, driven largely by entrenched gang violence and economic despair. These numbers are not just statistics. They represent a fundamental breakdown in the social contract that keeps a community functioning. However, the narrative of a statewide crime wave is not entirely supported by the data when we zoom out. San Diego, the state's second most populous city, maintains a violent crime rate of just 8.12 per 1,000 residents, one of the lowest for a major metropolitan area in the United States. Even Los Angeles, despite its reputation and massive population, has a violent crime rate of approximately 14.28 per 1,000, which is lower than many similarly sized American cities. The discrepancy suggests that while crime is a severe, acute threat in specific pockets like Alameda County and the San Joaquin Valley, it is not a uniform crisis across the state. The Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC, recently found that while fear of crime is high, actual violent crime rates in many jurisdictions are still below their historical peaks from the 1990s. This leads us to question whether crime is the biggest threat to the state, or if it is a symptom of a deeper fracture. If crime is the fire, we must ask what is fueling the flames. This brings us to the second major contender, the homelessness crisis. Unlike crime, which fluctuates by zip code, homelessness in California is a statewide humanitarian disaster of unprecedented scale. The 2024 point-in-time counts reveal that California is home to nearly 487,000 homeless individuals, accounting for roughly 29% of the entire homeless population of the United States. This is a staggering statistic for a state that represents only about 12% of the national population. But the raw number is less terrifying than the nature of the crisis. Unsheltered homelessness. In Los Angeles City alone, nearly 70,000 people are sleeping outside, in tents, cars, or makeshift structures. The unsheltered rate in cities like Stockton and Stockton's County of San Joaquin has climbed over 81%, meaning the vast majority of their homeless population has zero access to a bed, a roof, or basic sanitation. The sheer visibility of this crisis argues for it being the primary threat. It impacts public health, strains city budgets, and fundamentally alters the character of public spaces. In Sacramento, the state capital, nearly 39,000 people are unsheltered, living in the shadow of the very buildings where policy is made. The data shows that while the rest of the country sees homelessness as a temporary transitional state, in California, it has become a permanent underclass. The churn, the rate at which people fall into homelessness versus those who exit, is broken. For every one person housed in Los Angeles County, approximately 2023 data suggested more than one person falls into homelessness. However, we must ask, is homelessness the root cause, Or is it the inevitable debris of a failed system? Recent studies show that high rates of homelessness in coastal cities like San Jose and San Francisco correlate almost perfectly with one specific variable, and it is not drug addiction or mental illness rates. It is the cost of rent. This evidence pivots our investigation toward the third and perhaps most formidable contender: skyrocketing housing costs. The data here is relentless and affects almost every single resident, not just the most vulnerable. As of late 2024 and entering 2025, the median household income in San Jose is over $141,000, yet the poverty rate remains at 13%. This anomaly exists because the cost of living has distorted the very definition of wealth. A mid-tier home in California is now more than twice as expensive as a typical mid-tier home in the rest of the United States. The gap is so extreme that a bottom-tier home in California costs 30% more than a mid-tier home elsewhere. This is not just inflation. It is a mathematical wall preventing an entire generation from accessing the American dream. The rental market is equally punishing. In 2025, renters in California generally need to earn nearly 3 times the state minimum wage just to afford the average asking rent. The California Housing Partnership found that nearly 80% of extremely low-income renter households are paying more than half of their income on housing costs. This is what economists call severe rent burden. But in practical terms, it means one missed paycheck, one medical emergency, or one car repair leads directly to the street. This connects our threats. The housing crisis is a direct engine of the homelessness crisis. When rent increases by just $100 in a major metro area, homelessness counts typically see a corresponding percentage rise. The mortgage lock-in effect, where homeowners cling to low interest rates from 2020, has frozen inventory, driving prices even higher and forcing more people into the rental market, further squeezing supply. If the definition of a threat is something that destabilizes a foundation of society, housing costs are currently eroding the state's middle class faster than any criminal enterprise could hope to. However, there's a fourth, often overlooked contender that binds these all together: the lack of economic opportunity and deep structural inequality. We often think of California as a rich state, boasting the world's 5th largest economy. But the 2024/2025 data exposes a tale of two Californias that suggests the economic engine is sputtering for the majority. While the median income in San Francisco sits at a healthy $139,801, the poverty rate in Long Beach is 15%, and in the agricultural hubs like Fresno and Bakersfield, median incomes plummet to the $75,000 to $80,000 range. In these Central Valley cities, the poverty is not just a statistic. It is a generational trap. The Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC, reports that income inequality has reached historic highs, with top incomes growing significantly while bottom-tier incomes stagnate. The threat here is the evaporation of the California deal, the idea that hard work leads to upward mobility. In 2025, 1 in 3 Californians lives in or near poverty when factoring in the cost of living. This lack of economic opportunity is the silent driver of crime in places like Stockton and Oakland. It is the reason why a $3,000 rent check is impossible for a service worker in Los Angeles. When 40% of lower-income adults worry about housing costs every single day, the psychological and economic toll acts as a brake on the entire state's productivity. Businesses are leaving not just because of taxes, but because their employees simply cannot afford to live within a 2-hour commute to the office. The exodus of the working class to states like Nevada, Arizona, and Texas is a direct result of this economic failure. If the workforce leaves, the tax base crumbles. If the tax base crumbles, the funding for solving homelessness and fighting crime evaporates. So, how do we weigh these 4 threats against each other? If we look at the immediate physical danger, crime in cities like Oakland and Stockton takes the lead. The violent crime rates there are unacceptable and demand immediate intervention. But if we look at human suffering and moral failure, the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles and San Francisco is the clear winner. The sight of 115,000 people unhoused in a single county is a humanitarian emergency that rightly draws international condemnation. However, If we act as a doctor diagnosing a patient, we have to look for the disease, not just the symptoms. Crime in distressed areas is often a symptom of poverty. Homelessness is almost exclusively a symptom of the housing shortage and economic fragility. Therefore, the data overwhelmingly points to the intersection of housing costs and economic inequality as the single biggest threat. It is the threat multiplier. It is the reason the homeless shelters are full. It is the reason families in Long Beach are falling into poverty. It is the reason employers in San Jose cannot hire janitors or teachers. The Public Policy Institute of California's recent statewide surveys confirmed that the residents agree. When asked to name the most important issue facing people in California today, economic conditions and housing costs consistently rank at the top, often polling higher than crime. Despite the media focus on theft, Californians understand intuitively that their safety is tied to their stability. A neighbor who can afford their rent is a neighbor who is not on the street. A young person with a pathway to a middle-class job is a young person less likely to turn to gang violence in Stockton or Bakersfield. Let's look at the specific data for the big three cities to see this mechanism in action. In San Francisco, you have high incomes, $139,000, but high property crime and homelessness because the cost of entry is so high that the bottom falls out. In Los Angeles, you have moderate incomes, $90,000 countywide, but catastrophic housing costs, leading to the largest unsheltered population in the nation, 29,000 plus in the city alone. In San Diego, you have a slightly better balance and, consequently, a lower crime rate and a slightly more manageable, though still rising, homeless population. The pattern is clear. Where the economic math breaks the hardest, the social order crumbles the fastest. Furthermore, the 2025 outlook suggests this economic threat is mutating. The California Poverty Measure, which accounts for social safety nets, shows that without state intervention, poverty rates would be even higher, but with the state facing budget deficits. Partially due to a fluctuating tax base relying on high earners, the ability to fund these safety nets is at risk if the housing market does not correct or if wages do not rise to meet the cost of living. The 17.7% of Californians currently in poverty could easily swell to 20% or 25%. That is a level of economic disenfranchisement that historically leads to massive social unrest. It is also crucial to address the perception gap. While violent crime is statistically lower than in previous decades for most of the state, the fear of crime is driving policy changes and recalls. This fear is a threat in itself because it can lead to reactionary policies that drain resources from the root causes. We spend billions on policing and prisons. California spends more than almost any other state on its correctional system, yet we often fail to fund affordable housing construction that would prevent the disorder in the first place. The 2024 data showed that while homelessness grew by 3% in California, it grew by 18% nationally. This suggests that California's massive investments in housing are having some effect, acting as a dam holding back a tidal wave. But the dam is leaking. In conclusion, while the violence in Oakland is terrifying and the tents in Los Angeles are tragic, they are the visible scars of a deeper infection. The biggest threat to California right now is the economic reality that the state has become a gated community for the wealthy and a trap for the poor. The skyrocketing housing costs and the lack of economic opportunity for the working class are actively dismantling the California dream. When a teacher, a firefighter, or a nurse cannot afford to live in the city they serve, the city eventually ceases to function. The data from 2024 and 2025 is a screaming alarm bell. Until California solves the math of housing and wages, the crime will continue, the homelessness will persist, and the exodus will accelerate. The threat is not just that people are leaving, it is that the people who stay can no longer afford to live. And that is a crisis no amount of policing can arrest.